Welcome everybody to this week's Student Talk Back panel discussion. As I think you know by this point in the semester, we're using two different formats for our lunch panel discussions. Every other week, as we've done in the years past, we bring in two off-campus guests as well as two student panelists to talk about an issue or a political matter of the day. But every other week this semester, we're really fortunate that Professor Bob Shrum has agreed to join us for an ongoing series of political conversations. And for today's discussion, Professor Shrum and I are going to be joined by my old friend Matt Klink. Matt is currently the owner and president of the consulting firm Klink Campaigns, but in the past he wrote for Rudy Giuliani in the run-up to the 2008 presidential election, and he's worked for over 20 years in the field of strategic public affairs and his political campaign experience at the state, local, and national level. Matt, we're very happy to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
And although by this point in his time here, Bob Shrum needs no introduction, he deserves one, so he's going to get one anyway. We're just very lucky not only to have Bob here for today's panel, but on campus. And as I think all of you know, he's the USC Dornsife, Carmen and Louis Warschaw Chair in Practical Politics. He's a political consultant who's worked on no fewer than 8 presidential campaigns. He oversaw victory in no fewer than 30 United States Senate campaigns and 8 winning campaigns for governor in various states around the country. And certainly one of the nation's most astute political analysts. As always, Bob, thank you so much for joining us, Bob Shrum. And for these discussions, I'm joined by a co-moderator, not from the Daily Trojan, as we've done on many of our panels, but every 2 weeks by one of the Unruh Institute student workers. And this week, my co-moderator is Nathaniel Haas, who is not only a student worker at the Unruh Institute, not only a columnist for the USC's Daily Trojan and Neon Tommy, but also, am I allowed to tell?
Yeah, go ahead.
Also recently accepted in the USC Gould School of Law. So welcome, Nathaniel, and congratulations. And for those of you who have heard my why not to go to law school speech, no, I lose one every once in a while, but it's not going to happen again anytime soon. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the 2016 presidential election. And for anyone who would take the time, like most of you, to attend a panel discussion like this, you know that although for many people the campaign is months away from becoming a reality in their lives, in fact, the preparations for that campaign have been underway for quite some time. And so we're going to have a conversation today with Matt and with Bob about what to look for in the early stages of the campaign and how what's going on now might impact the outcomes both in the primaries next spring and in the general election next fall. Nathaniel, do you want to start the questioning?
Sure. So I want to direct the first question to Professor Shrum. We talked about the Hillary effect, and do you think that that will keep strong Democrat candidates who would ordinarily run out of the field because she's likely running, or do you think that she'll face a difficult primary with challengers? And if so, who do you think those challengers will be?
I don't think she'll face a difficult primary. I think she basically is at this point the nominee. The only person who could defeat Hillary Clinton is Hillary Clinton. Maybe I could add Bill Clinton. But I don't think that will happen. I think it will be a very disciplined campaign. That's why I think they're taking their time getting ready. She has a much bigger lead at this point than she did in 2007. In 2007, in early March, she was at 37%. Barack Obama was at 22%. She's now running in the high 50s to the high 60s, even into the 70s. So I don't think that you would see, Joe Biden would like to run for president. I like him a lot. I would not like to see him end his career this way, and I assume and hope his friends will persuade him that he shouldn't. Elizabeth Warren is clearly not running. Despite all the noise on the web, she keeps saying, I'm not running, I'm not running, I'm not running. And we now find out that she's been meeting with Hillary Clinton to talk about what Hillary Clinton should be saying. That said, I think there's a very good chance that Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, who is actually a serious smart guy. we did his campaigns. One of my partners did most of the work back when I was in the business for Congress and then for the Senate. And I think he would run knowing that he was not going to be the nominee, but that under the proportional representation rules that apply now in both parties, he could get 10 to 15% of the delegates and could make a statement about some of the things he cares about, like, for example, taking the cap off Social Security taxes as a way of making the system whole for another 40 or 50 years. So I think he might run. Jim Webb, I venture no prediction about. He's unpredictable inherently. But I think she will be the nominee. And I don't share, there are two shibboleths about this that I don't agree with. One is that, and it's the one I'll talk about, maybe we'll get to the other one later.
Say for future reference, not to just interrupt for a second, for future reference, when the term shibboleth is used, you should assume that the speaker is going to actually disagree with it, as opposed to saying this is a shibboleth with which I greatly admire and agree.
Yeah, I am going to disagree with it. Why don't I call it a political factoid? The idea that somehow or other she would benefit from a contested primary is not one I agree with. I think that, as I said earlier, they will be very disciplined in getting her ready. I think having a united party while the other side is fighting is a good idea, not a bad idea. And I also think it lets you not only prepare for the general and position yourself for the general election, it lets you use your advertising that way.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. And Matt, we want to ask you about the Republicans in just a minute. But before we do, just to pick up on Bob's observations on the Democratic field, your thoughts. If Hillary Clinton does not have a significant primary challenge, does that allow her to begin to reposition herself toward the center, much in the way that Barack Obama did 3 years ago, while the Republicans fight it out for conservative voters? Or do you see a potential downside, unlike Bob, to her running without serious competition?
Well, I could argue both pretty convincingly. I think that any candidate benefits from going through the rough and tumble of, debating other candidates openly and in public and making sure that you get your head knocked in a couple times early so that you don't do that late. That being said, Bob has persuaded me that, clearly it's an advantage for her at this point, I think, to not have any competition or to have someone in name only who runs to her extreme left. The first word to describe Bernie Sanders, socialist, would allow Hillary Clinton to still hug the extreme left and still be considered a moderate, especially by the mainstream media. That being said, Hillary Clinton's biggest enemy is herself. She's not a good candidate. And she distrusts the media, which is going to create some huge problems for her. She's got a huge foreign policy liability. Also, I think that the Clinton Global Initiative, for all of the good that it's done, it's going to wrap her in controversy left and right. So if she's smart and Mr. Podesta, who's going to be one of her senior advisors, is advising her and she uses this time wisely, not having anyone running against her could be a huge benefit, but Hillary will be Hillary, and just as a pitcher cannot change his throwing motion, Hillary can't change the type of candidate she is.
So, as a follow-up question, on the other side of the aisle, Mitt Romney has announced that he's not running for president.
Thank God, by the way.
Which I guess begs the question, do you think that signals that the party is coalescing around Jeb Bush? And do you think that the party is going to make similar attempts as they obviously made in persuading Mitt Romney not to run, to sort of stem the tide of other more radical candidates like Rand Paul or Ted Cruz from sort of causing Jeb Bush the same problems that Romney had to deal with in 2012 from
Yeah,
Santorum?
I disagree with the premise of your question. The party is not coalescing around one candidate. The money in the Republican Party, or the mainstream Republican Party, is going to back Jeb Bush, or at least apparently to do so right now. There is also the other populist part of the Republican Party, which Tea Party, populist, same thing. They don't want a mainstream candidate. We had a mainstream candidate with Mitt Romney, and he got destroyed. We had a candidate that was backed by distrusted by, but ultimately backed by the mainstream in 2008, and he got destroyed by Obama. I think that the biggest challenge that the Republicans face right now is they need someone who doesn't have the last name Bush, who can be a credible challenger. And as an observation in general, I'm kind of disappointed that in a nation of 330 million people, that America can't do better than a Clinton and a Bush to run for president in 2016. It's pretty depressing that a 62-year-old Bush and a 67-year-old Clinton is the best we've got. Doesn't inspire me for the future.
Well, then we'll have you back in 2 weeks to talk about the 2036 presidential campaign between Chelsea Clinton and George P. Bush.
George P. Yeah, exactly.
But in the meantime, Bob, we asked Matt to offer his analysis of the Democratic primary. So we'd like to have you weigh in on the Republicans. Historically, the conservative base of the party has made life difficult for a so-called Republican establishment candidate, but generally the establishment tends to nominate the candidate they want. How do you see the Republican primary unfolding, and how does that set up a general election?
I think that could change this year because of the increasing influence of the Tea Party and similar folks inside the Republican Party. I think I saw a poll in New Hampshire where 41% of people said that Jeb Bush's position on immigration meant that they could not vote for him. It is true that the Republicans have always nominated the next person in line. I mean, you have to go back to Barry Goldwater before there's an exception to that. And who knows who was in line that year, because it was a crazy year. So I think, number one, Bush is the strongest Republican candidate. I don't share Matt's disdain for a Clinton-Bush matchup, especially when he emphasizes age, since I resemble that remark. I think Bush is reassuring to people. They think he's more moderate than he is. Actually, he's quite conservative, except on a few issues. And the money in the Republican Party is very heavily going to go, the big money, to Bush. However, as Howard Dean demonstrated, and then Kerry picked it up, and then Obama picked it up, the potential for raising money on the internet is huge. And I think one of these Republican insurgents could establish that financial base. And also, given the campaign finance rules we have, everything has changed. In the old days, you dropped out of the presidential campaign for the nomination when you ran out of money. Now you don't run out of money, because there's always a billionaire, Foster Friess, Sheldon Adelson, somebody, who will be there and say, I'm happy to finance your campaign, or happy to run an independent expenditure campaign for you, and you just run a kind of, bare bones, get yourself around to the various states. In the end, I think they'll probably nominate Bush, but I think it will be a struggle, and I think he will be battered some along the way, especially on the issue of immigration and maybe on the issue of education reform. Oh, and by the way, I'll just register my disagreement without getting into a prolonged debate with the proposition that foreign policy is somehow or other Hillary Clinton's great weakness.
Actually, let's get into a prolonged debate. Although, as you correctly pointed out in the past, Bob, there's no way to predict these things a year and a half in advance. It appears at this very early stage in the election that foreign policy and national security could play a greater role than it has in some time. Given the terrorist threat of ISIS, given challenges in the Ukraine and the Pacific Rim and elsewhere, is the question for both of you, but Bob, you should start since you raised the topic, is if we do end up with a campaign that focuses more heavily on national security issues, talk about the pluses and minuses of that for your respective parties. Bob?
Well, first of all, from a historical point of view, it's another shibboleth to suggest that somehow or other foreign policy doesn't play a role in these elections. I mean, ask Lyndon Johnson about his re-election campaign in 1968 and what happened to it. I mean, there are times when foreign policy is absolutely critical. I think, and I'm not trying to evade this, I think that so much depends on circumstances. So much depends on what happens with ISIS. So much depends on whether or not we have another attack in the United States. So much depends on how the Europeans handle this new copycat form of terrorism where somebody just gets a gun and shoots up a cafe or a bookstore. And I think a lot will depend, if foreign policy is a big issue, on how the two candidates, the two nominees, handle it in the debates and in their back and forth with each other. It really matters. I mean, if you recall the second, or the town hall debate with Romney, it was the second debate, with Romney and Obama, when Romney launched his attack on Benghazi, and Candy Crowley, and proving once again is something I always say, the moderator is as important as the two candidates who were debating, said, but the president did call it an act of terror. That was a pretty decisive moment and helped Obama come back from the debacle of the first debate. So I think it matters what they do in debates. I am skeptical that the Republican focus on Benghazi will have a huge impact on voters who are actually thinking about whether or not they're going to vote for Clinton or Bush. If, for example, we have the Back to the Future election, I don't think those voters in the middle are focused in on this or are likely to be focused in on it. If you look at the Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960, that first debate was decisive because Nixon's running on experience, he's the guy who can handle national security, et cetera. Kennedy crosses the threshold, looks like he can be a commander-in-chief, and basically I think that removes that issue as a deciding factor in 1960.
I guess the follow-up I want to ask to Mr. Klink is, you had already sort of alluded to the national security foreign policy problems that you perceive that a Clinton nomination would hold. We'd also sort of talked about how President Obama's foreign policy is, abroad sort of seen as a failure. And so I guess the question is, if Hillary Clinton is having to run on, a lot of these national security issues, how does she, A, dispel the criticism of her own foreign policy, but also B, distance herself from the foreign policy that many people have attacked President Obama for following?
She can't, and it's a mess. I mean, ISIS. I just made a list of some of these. ISIS, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Libya. By the way, not Benghazi in Libya, now ISIS in Libya. Egypt, Sisi, the Sisi government is now attacking into Libya, but ISIS is now making inroads into Egypt. Syria, Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Europe in general, the future of NATO, not even to mention foreign trade, and let's not forget Guantanamo Bay. All of these things are all up in the air. The world is more unstable than it was 8 years ago, and it doesn't look like it's going to settle down anytime soon. You have a Europe where they've been slashing their defense budgets on the premise that the United States will always be there to come to the rescue, except now you don't have any promise of the United States coming to the rescue anymore. 11 airstrikes a day in Syria is not going to defeat ISIS, and the Obama straw man of saying we can either do 11 airstrikes or we can put 500,000 troops on the ground, that's a false argument. You could put special forces on the ground. We've been saying we're going to train Syrian moderates for the last 4 years. I think they're still looking for the Syrian moderates to train. So foreign policy, it's not a question of if it's going to be a part of this election. It's going to be a big part. And heaven forbid if something happens in the United States, it's going to be an overwhelming part. It will even trump domestic concerns. And I don't think that Hillary, it may not be her Achilles heel, but she was Obama's foreign policy for 4 years.
We could easily spend the rest
I
of the...
say that Matt's description of that is a classic case of the wish being father to the thought.
We could easily spend the next 40, 45 minutes on foreign policy in the presidential campaign, and maybe we'll schedule another lunch discussion later in the semester where we focus specifically on these issues. But I want to bring up a couple of others as well. So Matt, we'll start with you on this one. Yesterday, a judge in Texas decided that the Obama administration's decision not to deprioritize the deportation of up to 5 million immigrants in this country without documentation was, well, they have not decided that it's against the law, but decided that the decision should not be implemented until a more definitive decision has been made. So all of a sudden, you have a president of the United States who's been very aggressive on the issue of immigration reform, an issue that appears to have been working to his benefit politically. Does the judge's decision put an issue front and center that creates difficulties for your party going forward?
Well, immigration was always going to be an issue for the Republican Party, and I think that the decision yesterday gives the president the ability to say, I want to do it, but some conservative judge in Texas stopped me from doing it. Now, I don't think that it's going to be long-term. I think that this will probably be temporary. I ultimately think that it's something that should wind up before the Supreme Court. But leaving aside the policy, because I'm by no means an expert on immigration policy, politically, it does put Republicans in a very awkward position. I think Bob very astutely pointed out at the beginning about the number of people who would not vote for Jeb Bush because of his stance on immigration. That's a stance that probably is more mainstream and supported by the other 60 or 39% of the population. I mean, I know or the other 69% of 59%, excuse me, I was not a math major. The other 59% of the population that believes that something does need to be done on immigration. But you have a set conservative core of the Republican Party that wants to throw everybody out of the country. That's not realistic. It's not going to happen, but they're going to drag the Republican Party through the mud ultimately to get to a place to say, yeah, you were right, we should have done this a long time ago. So I just think immigration's going to be a problem, and I don't think that yesterday, while everybody says, thank goodness, I think it makes the problem worse.
And so, Bob, let me frame the question for you. Let's assume, because I think it's only fair to assume, that President Obama would much rather have his executive orders implemented. He would much rather have these young people and their parents able to stay in this country. That said, at least for the time being, he doesn't have that, but it seems like he's been given a fairly valuable political issue for him and his party going forward.
Well, substantively, the decision does not affect the Dreamers. The judge did not reach the issue of the Dreamers at all. It affects the executive order from a couple of months ago that applies to, like, their parents, as you said, and a number of other categories of people who are immigrants. Yeah, I think the president wants the executive order implemented. I know some Republican consultants who want the executive order implemented. They want this issue done, gone, and finished, because it's very hard for Republicans to reach the Latino vote levels that they need to win the presidency under these circumstances. I mean, Karl Rove said, and this was in 2004, and the number may be inching up, that you need about a Republican needs about 40% of the Hispanic vote to win. And if you look at what happened in 2012, where Romney really was destroyed was with the Hispanic vote.
It's like 12% or something.
It was very, I think it was a little more than that, but it was very low. And the other impact this is having on Hispanics, Republicans have always comforted themselves with the idea that, well, you know, they're Catholics and they're socially more conservative and all of this. Whether as a result of this or other factors, in the exit polling, the Hispanics who voted in 2012 were more liberal on both social and economic issues than Americans in general, than the electorate in general. So, yeah, I think Republicans are doing the work of the Democratic Party in this and are making it tougher to win a presidential election. That said, the structure of congressional seats and the way the Senate is apportioned, we could be in for a fairly long period of divided government where it's harder for Republicans to win the presidency, hard for Democrats to get the Senate back, although I think they can, and really hard to get the House back.
So I guess the question then becomes, you know, under the premise, of course, the 2014 election in the midterms had the lowest turnout since World War II. If you're a Democrat or a Republican strategist and you're looking at these numbers and immigration helping the Democrats turn out a Latino vote, but also bearing in mind that the Democrats had a problem turning out the Latino vote in states like Colorado, going forward, how do you think both parties will approach turnout in the 2016 election, and who do you think that the overall issues will benefit and favor? Because, you know, in a presidential election, the turnout obviously favors the Democrats, and I guess it also sort of begs the question of, is a candidate like Hillary Clinton able to turn out sort of the same voting base that Barack Obama turned out? So I'll throw it to either of you to sort of talk about that issue, not just from an immigration perspective, but also from, I think, a more broader perspective?
Well, some of this Matt may agree with, and some of it I'm sure he'll disagree with. First of all, Colorado in 2014 was a wonderful proof that you can duplicate all the social messaging elements that the Obama people have, and if you don't have a message to promote through that social media, it's not going to work. And so I expect on social media by 2016, both parties will be pretty much state of the art. They'll both be there. What will matter is what they're saying. If you look at Hillary Clinton and assume that she's going to be the nominee, she's going to have basic decisions to make. Where is she going to position herself, for example, on the economy? I think she will not rerun her 2008 primary campaign. I don't think she'll rerun Bill's 1996 campaign. I don't think it will be a triangulating campaign. I think it will be closer to Obama than it is to Clinton in the 1990s. And I know at least one of my students here will be very disappointed by that. But I think that's what she'll do. I think Bush, if he's the Republican nominee, will try very hard to talk about conservative policies and values as an answer to the problems of the middle class and the problems of income inequality. All of that said, I believe turnout will be very high. I think Republicans hope that, as they did in 2012, that it will go down and that the electorate will go back toward being more a 2004 electorate than a 2008 or a 2012 electorate. I don't think that will happen. I think women will be enthused about Hillary Clinton. I think on the right, there will be a tremendous desire to beat her, and that will motivate a lot of Republicans to come out. And I think under present circumstances, you're going to see Latinos and African Americans coming out very strongly for Hillary Clinton. In part, by the way, because like African American voters are pretty smart. They know if she loses, a lot of what Obama did goes away.
Well, so where to begin? 2016, turnout will be less than 2012, but greater than 2014. I think that it's still very much debatable whether the Obama voters of 2008 and 2012 will transition to Democratic voters in 2016. I do agree. I mean, African Americans will overwhelmingly continue to support Democrats. I think, what, 92% or something like that is the figure historically. I mean, it's pretty high.
Yes.
I think that Latinos, if Bush is the eventual nominee, Bush has always run well with Latino candidates, and that creates some significant problems. The Democrats have a problem in that they're not attracting white married women, nor are they attracting working class men, white men. They're fleeing the Democratic Party, and I think that creates some interesting problems for the party as well. All that being said, I think that the lion's share of the spending from a technology perspective at least will be funneled toward turnout operations. Everybody wants to try to mimic what Obama was successful in doing in 2008 and 2012. Again, that may be another benefit that Hillary has by not having an opponent, is that she can crank out technologically sophisticated turnout machine, learning from the Obama people who hopefully are sharing that playbook with her. But it will be a lower turnout percentage-wise than 2012.
Well, we want to get to all of your guys' questions in just a minute, but one more from up here before we broaden the conversation. Question for both of you, because I think you've both done a very good job over the first 20 several minutes talking about your party's prospective strengths and your opponent's likely weaknesses in the next election. I want to turn that on its head for a moment. I'd like each of you to tell us what your greatest concern is for your party heading into the 2016 election. What is the one thing as a strategist and an analyst that concerns you most, and what would you do to address that concern?
Well, the one thing that concerns me most, I've already said. I think Bush is the strongest Republican candidate. I think if he can win the nomination relatively early and come across as not a moderate in the classic sense, but as a kind of, you can't use the word compassionate conservatism these days, or the phrase, you'd lose the Republican primaries. But if he can somehow or other go into the general election with that and give the sense that he has some ideas that kind of seem mainstream to people, I think he can be a very formidable candidate. We haven't talked about Scott Walker and some other people, and we could. But, and how do you handle that? I mean, Hillary Clinton, if she runs, which she's going to, and if she's the Democratic nominee, which she will be, has to have a vision for the future. This cannot be, let's restore the 1990s. This cannot be, I'm just going to keep doing what we've been doing. It's got to say, here are the big problems before the country. Here's my vision for dealing with them. Here are the big steps I want to take forward. By the way, and this is just a footnote, if the Supreme Court throws out the Affordable Care Act, health care will become a gigantic issue in the 2016 election.
They wouldn't be throwing it out. They would just say that the subsidies that people are getting wouldn't be allowable. It would just cause premiums to go up.
Well, it would cause millions of people to lose their insurance, and then you would have in the Democratic Party a big demand for how do we fix this, how do we repair it, where do we go on health care, and you would have, I think, a lot more pressure on Republicans than exists today to actually say what the replace, not repeal is.
Well, which is a nice segue, Bob, into what
And so, Matt, your turn. Bob's greatest concern, to recap, is the prospect of a Jeb Bush Republican nomination. And although he didn't say it here today, his plan to mitigate that is by running and funding a Ted Cruz for President super PAC. And I think that's a very viable plan. Matt, what is your greatest concern for Republicans heading into 2016, and what is the party's best way to address that concern?
The biggest single concern that I have is the pull between nominating a candidate that motivates the base to turn out and nominating a candidate who can win in November. And the challenge in that is, if Jeb Bush can do it, can Jeff motivate the conservative base to get energized and turn out? Because the problem that you have when you get people like Scott Walker talking about, he doesn't believe in evolution and things like that, I think that just turns off a lot of the people that are middle of the road, independent, or even moderate Republican voters, the few of us that are remaining. It just creates some massive problems. So it's that constant pull between you need someone who can raise the $1 billion necessary to run and win, but also make sure that the conservative base is really energized and excited. Now, granted, if we're running against Hillary Clinton, I think that they're going to be excited. She's a good candidate to run against, but I think that's my biggest concern right now.
Well, this is really interesting. Just to sum up the last few minutes, the Democrats' greatest concern is that Republicans nominate a relative centrist, and the Republicans' greatest concern is that they don't. Very quick follow-up, and then I really do want to get to your guys' questions, is you both mentioned the governor of my home state, Scott Walker. Now, something interesting about the governor of Wisconsin. He didn't graduate from college. And if he were elected president, he would be the first president since Harry Truman not to have an undergraduate college degree. Quick question for both of you. Is that a problem?
No more than Hillary's age is a problem. I mean, all these things the press loves to write about, I don't think that's a problem at all. If he looks competent, smart, and seems to have big ideas about what he wants to do with the country, no, I don't think it's a problem.
To misquote Senator Lloyd Benson, Bob Walker is no Harry Truman. That being said, it depends on how it's handled. I don't think it would. Certainly, it's not something that Democrats could ever raise, given that they want to try to cater to the show working class ideals. But the intellectual elite within both parties, I know it grates them, and they have problems with it.
All right. Well, we've monopolized this conversation long enough, so let's open it up to all of you. Most of you, if not all of you, have heard me say this before, but 2 requests from Nathaniel and me before you ask your questions, and please raise your hand and one of us will call on you. Number 1, when we do call on you, if you can tell us your name just so we know who is participating in the conversation, who's joining us. And then second, once again, if you're questioning one of our guests on a point with which you and he disagree, we'd ask that you frame that disagreement as respectfully, with the same level of respect that you'd hope that they would show you if they were asking you a question on a point that you'd made with which they didn't agree. Questions for our panel?
Time for more pizza. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Correct. Well, I don't think there's any coincidence why she hashtag, hashtag grandmother or whatever it is. I think that that's clearly smart on her part to demonstrate that she does represent, married women. So I think that's clearly they understand. I mean, the numbers are the numbers, and it is a fact that the numbers for Democrats have been going down in those key demographics. But I think that Hillary will at least initially try to pull back a lot of that. And I think that Bob is right. The enthusiasm of a credible female candidate on the ticket, and I'll include that because we had evidence that a non-credible woman on the ticket doesn't help you at all. So a credible woman on the ticket will help immensely with female voters, marital status not included.
I have a follow-up then to that for Professor Shrum. You had talked about how Hillary's biggest obstacle, maybe it was you, Matt, Hillary's biggest obstacle is herself.
I said that.
And
Oh, okay.
Professor Shrum, you had talked about how Hillary needs to say, here are my goals for the future, here is my assessment of the problems. In 2008, candidate Hillary was very much also about the Ready for Hillary, first woman president, let's make history. How much of that do you think she relies on in 2012, and do you think that she relies on it to a bigger or to a lesser extent than she did in 2008?
Well, Nathaniel, first of all, they ran away from that for the first part of the 2008 campaign. I mean, they obviously didn't deny she was a woman, but she hardly ever talked about it in those terms because the people who she was listening to told her that as the first woman president, potentially, she had to be all about strength, never admitting she was wrong. She got herself in trouble early in the primary process by being unwilling to say that she had made a mistake when she voted for the Iraq War resolution. I think they will be more explicit this time about the historic nature of her candidacy. And I think that will help her with women voters and, frankly, with minorities. I've always been, if you go back and you look at like 1960, Kennedy got this bigger than usual, and it started to trend, support among Jewish voters. They'd have been Democratic, but he got even more. And that, I think, is because when they heard somebody say a Catholic can't be president, they also heard a Jew can't be president. And so I think these things, I don't know whether you want to call them identity politics or whatever, I think people do have this desire to be vindicated and to think that they have a role and a place in the society and that their children should have the same sort of chance as anybody else. She will, maybe I'll have to eat humble pie next year when we're doing this. She is not going to make the mistakes of 2008. She is not going to, I think she will, unlike Matt, I think she will be much more the candidate she was at the end of 2008, when she could no longer win the nomination, when she was spontaneous and real and often even funny, which she is in private. I think that that's the Hillary who will run for president. I do not think she will announce sitting by herself on a couch in her living room in a 3-minute video where she says, let's all have a conversation. I think she'll go out there and say, this is what I want to do for the country.
Bob, I think you raised a number of interesting points, but one in particular that struck me is the question of so-called identity politics. The idea that if an individual breaks through on behalf of a particular demographic group, or has the potential to, that's something that is motivating not just to members of that same group, but to others facing similar challenges as well. So the question I put to Matt is, with the Republican field that includes a Cuban American in Marco Rubio, an Indian American in Bobby Jindal, is there potential for Republicans to capitalize on this, or do those candidates ideological groundings create a challenge that keeps him from duplicating the kind of
I'm for
phenomenon
Bobby
Bob's
Jindal,
talking
by
about.
the way, so go ahead.
Sure you are with his popularity ratings in Louisiana. No, look, I think that this is the benefit if Bush is at the top of the ticket. You have someone who's fluent in Spanish. You have someone who lives in Miami. You have someone he married Latina. I mean, someone who's clearly comfortable talking with that specific, very large and growing constituency. I don't think that, while Marco Rubio is a bright and shining star in the Republican Party, I would be highly shocked if it were a Bush-Rubio ticket. I mean, I think they'd probably
One of them would have to move out of Florida.
they'd win Florida, yeah, for sure.
No, one has to move.
Oh, they can't be from the
No,
same
they can't be from, that's why Dick Cheney had to go back to Wyoming.
Got it. All that being said, I think if it is Bush, that he will choose someone who was probably more socially conservative as a vice president, like a Scott Walker or a governor from, not Bobby Jindal, as much as Bob would like, but you know, they'll try to complement the ticket. Who knows? It may be a woman Republican governor. I don't have a name, but I don't know.
Classic.
Well, in the Republican Party, if I may start there, I think that Matt's probably right about who will get picked, but I think it's also possible that Susana Martinez, the governor of New Mexico, could be picked. Now, you know, if you pick her, we're always closing the barn door on the last vice presidential mistake. So when we go through the vetting process. So if you picked her, you'd give her a basic foreign policy quiz before you made that choice, so that you would not repeat what went on in 2008.
She can't see Russia from her backyard.
Oh, but you can see Mexico. So I think that's a possibility. I think there probably will be a more conventional choice than that. By the way, I would add on this Bush thing, and it goes back to something Matt said, the tension in the party between nominating someone who satisfies the base and someone who can win the general election. Does Bush get pushed in the primaries to the point where he says things that will make him less attractive, for example, to Hispanic voters, or less attractive to women voters? I don't think we know that. I mean, I'll give you an example on an issue we're not even talking about right now, but which we are, in the country we are, but it goes to young people. Ted Cruz, if he runs, is going to stand in those debates and say, I am for a constitutional amendment to get rid of gay marriage and to give the states the power to determine who can be married. Where do you stand? It is the last question that Jeb Bush wants to be asked. He put out a statement after the decision was made in Florida saying, look, I've always thought marriage was between a man and a woman, but we have to be respectful and we have to respect the couples who are getting married, and obviously wants to drop the issue. So do a lot of people, and so do a lot of the fundraisers in the Republican Party. But what happens in those debates? And you're in Iowa, and do you really want to let Mike Huckabee win the Iowa caucuses, or Ted Cruz? So that's a tough issue. I think in the Democratic Party, the likeliest vice presidential picks are in no particular order, and this is the prediction business, so of course it's always wrong, are Tim Kaine from Virginia. It's a state that I think Hillary Clinton would really want to win, and I think he is, actually Obama considered him, but he had been in the Senate such a brief period of time, or he'd been governor such a, he just didn't have any national security experience, and Biden looked like someone he needed something like that. And I think that Julian Castro is a real possibility. And once again, I think you go through the process and make sure that he's up to the job, but he seems very impressive to me and very smart. Martin O'Malley wants it, the former governor of Maryland, who's toying around with running, and maybe he will run. However, briefly, I don't see what he gets you on the ticket. I mean, this whole thing that somehow or other young people vote for president because there's somebody young on the ticket is absurd. I mean, Ronald Reagan overwhelmingly won young people in 1980 and solidified a whole generation of people in that age cohort for the Republican Party. So I think the most likely picks are I'm not going to name five, are Kane or Castro.
If you were advising your respective party's nominee, well, okay, I'll put a more specific question to Bob first and then to Matt. Matt, one of the challenges that Al Gore faced in 2000 and that George H.W. Bush faced in 1988 was running to succeed a president without sound of their own party, without seeming like they were simply an echo or an imitator. If you were advising Hillary Clinton, more accurately, when Hillary Clinton asked for your advice, should she at some point, and if so, how should she distance herself from Barack Obama?
Well, I don't think it's a question of distance per se. I think it's a question of having distinctive policies for the future, distinctive ideas about what to do on some of the questions that really concern people. I mean, for example, student loan debt could be a place where I think she could do a fair amount and would have real resonance with people. She'll, depending on the foreign policy situation, she's going to have her own way of talking about the world. I don't think she can somehow or other say, gee, he had one foreign policy, I have another. I mean, she was his Secretary of State. But all of these things, I mean, George H.W. Bush's problem was he wanted to hug Ronald Reagan, and people didn't believe he was Ronald Reagan. And until he gave his acceptance speech, which was quite extraordinary, written by Peggy Noonan, he didn't really break through to people as someone who should be president. Al Gore's problem was, and of course I was involved, it was much more complicated. People thought that Clinton had been a good president. They liked the condition of the economy, and so he had very good job numbers, approval numbers, and he had the worst favorability numbers. I mean, not the worst, but he had appalling favorability numbers compared to his job approval numbers. The people did not want a third Clinton term, and the brilliance of the Bush campaign in 2000 was he was a compassionate conservative who wasn't going to change very much and was just going to let people share in the prosperity with the tax cut. And by the way, was also for a prescription. Gore was for a prescription drug benefit for seniors. He was. And it was a very, very smart campaign. And in the end, of course, I think Gore won, and that's that. Supreme Court took it away. Not much you can do about it.
We'll come back and do another panel discussion on Bush-Gore 2000 at some point later in the semester. In the meantime, Matt, similar challenge for Jeb Bush, but one without precedent. Today he's in Chicago, and in his speech on foreign policy, Jeb Bush is talking about his father and his brother, saying, I love my father and I love my brother, but I'm my own man. Is that good enough?
Well, no, given that the policy advisors that he has in comparison with his father and his brother are almost identical, at least in a number of senior level positions. I think, what did we say beforehand? It was 19 of 21. All that being said, if he hugs 41's foreign policy, I think that he would be a lot more popular than if he hugs 43's foreign policy. All that being said, Hillary Clinton will be running for Barack Obama's third term. And I think that whether or not people, like everybody talks about how the economy is doing better, people don't feel that. And they can talk about 5.6% unemployment, the U6 unemployment, long-term unemployment or underemployment skyrocketing. The only people who have gotten rich
It's actually going down.
Slightly.
It's going down.
Slightly.
It's going down. It's not skyrocketing.
2% growth rate. 2% growth rate during the Obama recovery. So, I mean, again.
You mean from the Bush depression?
I'm not getting in the way. You guys keep going.
It's all right.
Look, the economy, one of the things that's, I'm sorry, I don't think this is a version of hardball, but I do think that we ought to be accurate. The president's approval numbers are going up.
They are. I said
And
that.
so are.
I thought I'd said that. If
You
not,
did
I
not
meant
say
to.
that.
I apologize.
Okay. His approval numbers are going up. People's views of the economy are getting better. People are finally beginning to think things are getting better. Is that good enough for 2016? No. If it continues, will it be of a substantial help to Hillary Clinton in 2016? Yes. But it is, I mean, we had a long, drawn-out recovery from a very, very deep recession where we almost went off the cliff, and the world almost went off the cliff. Obama managed to win in 2012 when Romney wanted it to be a referendum on that because he turned the election into a choice. 2016, Matt, my disagreement is if we get down to 5% or 5.2% unemployment, if we get long-term unemployment down, if all of these things happen and people are feeling better about the economy, it's going to help Hillary Clinton.
I totally agree. And if you look at the record of the Obama economy, it does well in the first quarter of the year, and then it trends downward the next 3 quarters. So, I mean, again, I think it remains to be seen, but 2% growth over the last 6 years is not something that I think that anybody is going to be satisfied with. So we'll see.
Sarah, would you mind restoring some civility to this conversation?
I think Matt Half already answered that when he said Jeb Bush should hug Bush 41's foreign policy and not Bush 43. And I think to the extent he hugs either of their foreign policies, that's what he will do. He will say, I am my own man. I do think he will ultimately have to answer the question, unless he did it today in Chicago, whether or not he thought the Iraq war was a good idea. I don't think he can just say, I'm my own man, and I don't need to answer that question.
That's what he's getting paid the big bucks to answer.
But what I hear, and I'll take Bob's point, Matt, and
I think if he did this and he was smart, he would say, and this is a political answer because I don't agree with this, he would say something like, I think we had indications that there was a real danger in Iraq. He was a terrible dictator. I think it was right to act, but I think we should have prepared for the post-war period and had a much more comprehensive plan in place for how to deal with Iraq. Boom, he separates himself, but he doesn't separate himself so far that he sort of renounced his own brother.
So
never going to give a yes.
Matt, just to put this on you in a slightly different way, given Bob's answer and given Sarah's question, what I hear on this topic is Jeb Bush's challenge has much less to do with family and surname than it does with public policy. In other words, what's much more relevant to the campaign discussion over the next year plus is what he says about the Iraq war, not his relationship with the president who declared it.
Absolutely. I mean, he's going to have to answer, that question will certainly be asked about what did he support the Iraq war, and if so or if not, what would he have done? And he will probably answer it very similar to that. I think that I don't want to say the benefit because it means that Iraq is even worse off than it is now. But look, the Fallujah and all of the places that Americans toiled and died and spilled blood over that were at least in the right people's hands aren't anymore. And if Iraq continues to go in the direction that it's going, ISIS is right at Baghdad. And this conversation about Iraq, it may not even be a question of whether or not you support the Iraq war. It might be, what will you do to get ISIS out of Baghdad? I mean, I know that's, let's hope that doesn't happen, but that's where it's headed right now. If you look at some of the maps of where ISIS is, they're all around parts of the significant portions of the city in force. And again, 11 airstrikes is not going to repel them from that area. Yeah.
She's taken the position that it was a mistake, straight out.
Not
that
straight
she-
out. She saw religion and came to it.
Right, no, but she's straight up, straight down the line, it was a mistake, I shouldn't have voted for it. I don't think he'll ever go to that point.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm sure he's on the record in some ways at the beginning of the war supporting his brother, so I don't think he can do that. None of these things, and I say this about my comments and Matt's, none of these things are static. We have no idea what's going to happen in 3 months, and do we get a nuclear deal with Iran? Does the president decide that we need a much more muscular response to ISIS or ISIL? And any of those things does Greece get thrown out of the euro, and does that create, I think, Greece has an economy the size of Dallas, Texas, and it should not sink the whole world, but it will be destabilizing if it happens. So all of these things are moving targets.
And that is why we'll continue to talk about them over the course of this semester and next year's presidential election. In the meantime, though, join me in thanking Bob Shrum and Matt Klink for a terrific conversation. Also, thanks to my co-moderator in Gould Law class of 2018, Nathaniel Haas. And to our entire team at the Unruh Institute for putting on these programs every week, to Kirsten Olson, to Jody Epstein, to Tanya Mercado, to Alyssa Rangel, and especially to Laura Hill for the work they do in putting these programs together. Guys, thank you very, very much. Couple quick reminders. Tonight, for those of you who are up for a further political conversation, tonight at 7 o'clock we'll be having our every other week political roundtable that we co-sponsor with the Political Student Assembly. That conversation will take place in Mudd Hall, room 102, with our two legislators in residence, Anthony Portantino and Mark Weiland. And tonight they'll be talking about labor and the minimum wage debate. Next Wednesday, Student Talk Back, we will be talking about the threat of ISIS, not necessarily in the context of the presidential campaign, but in terms of real-world impact. So join us here next week for a conversation about the terrorist threat that ISIS presents. And then finally, although the drop dead deadline has passed, we at the Unruh Institute are still placing students in internships. And so if you are looking to get involved in government politics or some other aspect of public service, come to VKC 263. We'd be happy to help. Thanks again to our panel for a great conversation, and thanks to all of you for coming. We'll either see you tonight or we'll see you next week. Thanks again.